And we are back to Global Citizen. Malkah, we have been discussing the kind of international context of the student and political movements of 1968, but I think we have to consider also what happened in Mexico. Don't you think?
I think that Mexico was a very different movement than the rest of the world, in the sense that it was a student movement, a libertarian movement that was really countering the oppression that we used to live. I mean, Díaz Ordaz was a president that was, we can still remember the old ways of politics. He was very effective in the international arena and with the economy. We have to really consider that Mexico was experimenting a huge growth. But influenced by the Cuban Revolution, the youth thought that this oppression required doing something about it. We had no freedom of expression, as it was subsequently seen with the massacre of the 2 of October. The students really didn't have a space where to express all these new trends that were really starting to flourish in the international arena. Yeah. And I think that they were met, any space of liberty was met with oppression. Yeah. With not only oppression, with an enormous violence, unlike any other country. Here we had oppression and no consequences whatsoever for the political class.
Yeah. In trying to understand, I think, the student movement of 1968 in Mexico, it might be perhaps useful to compare it to what happened in France. In France, in my view, the students and the youth were trying to emancipate themselves from the shackles of modern society. In Mexico, in opposition to this, in Mexico, we want to embrace modernity. So it's different. While in Mexico, the demands were for more liberty, for more democracy, for more economic prosperity. In France, they wanted to get rid of the problems that modern society were trying to instigate in them.
I don't necessarily agree with you. I think that there are many parallelisms as in France. You had the President de Gaulle that was a very good leader in the Second World War, but he was also an oppressive leader in the sense that he didn't want to renounce. He was not receptive to the students speaking about these needs. And then all the workers were not being paid. Yeah. And for instance, there was an agreement, even with a society that is impossible to conceive nowadays, where they granted to the workers an increase of 10% in their salaries, which by that time was enormous. Yeah, so I think that here it was a student movement that was rebelling. You are right. I mean, in France, they were not rebelling against modernity. They were rebelling against also the shackles that they had with the models of the Second World War. Yeah. But I think that there is a parallelism in that sense.
Yeah, but I think you have to grant also that in Mexico, the students were very aware of the fact that they were living in a developing country. So they were very mindful that the problems were not only their problems, but there was a sizable portion of the Mexican population, like the workers, that needed still to embrace modernity, because at the end of the day, one can argue that the PRI is, and was at that time, a pre-liberal, pre-democratic, and pre-modern political regime.
But it's interesting that you had this contrast with the Cuban Revolution that was really presenting another model for society that really rebelled against these oppressive governments, like the PRI, where everybody had to consent to what the presidential figure was enormous. Yeah. Cuba was presenting something fresh for the society, something fresh for students. So it's the case that in Cuba, for instance, Mexico was celebrating, the students were celebrating the Cuban Revolution, and they met the opposition by the military. Yeah. And I think that is super important because, I mean, many of the things that we have currently in Mexico are we drag them on from history of that time. So it's a rebellion against modernity, but also against parents, against authority, against these oppressive models of sexuality as well, where women had to sit in one place and men in another place.
Yeah, at the end of the day,
the church as well, I dare to say.
At the end of the day, I think we agree. My only point is that perhaps the Mexican student movement was even more complex. than the French and the American, because we were dealing not only with modernity, but with pre-modernity. That was my only point.
Okay, and with lack of democracy, there was a simulation of democracy where you have a Congress, you have a president, you had all these benchmarks that you have to meet in a democracy, but in reality there was no democracy whatsoever. So then students were saying that all this simulation and this presidential figure and these models that you used to keep on fulfilling and keep on leading, in reality they were questioning for the first time maybe in history of the Mexican nation, why should we follow that? Is it the correct way to follow it? And what can we do about it? Because they had a reference of the international arena, as we previously mentioned. And I think that is important because all these movements always are national with an international outlook. They're always conscious of what is going on in the world. And they're trying to adapt the best parts of what is happening in those movements to our national context. And I think that is incredibly important.
Yeah, they were conscious.
One of the key things
they were conscious of what was happening abroad, but they were conscious also of what was happening inside Mexico.
Mexico.
Yeah.
We'll be back in a second.